Welcome back, class, to MUS 222, the history and sociology of rock music. So we'll be looking at Module 6 today, the British invasion, and this is the British invasion that happened in the 1960s. Pull out your notes, get ready to write, and let's check out what happened in the 60s with the British invasion. In early 1964, the Beatles came to America for the very first time. Their arrival had been highly anticipated for weeks. When their plane finally touched down on February 7th, there was somewhere around 10,000 screaming fans waiting, and of course those were mostly teenage girls. By the last week in March, they held the top 5 positions on the Billboard pop chart, with 7 more in the Hot 100. But the Beatles were just beginning, and a flood of other English groups soon followed, playing their own unique brand of good old American rock and roll. Their sound was called Mercy Beat, which was upbeat and joyous with a relentless drive. Throughout the years following World War II, English youth had absorbed whatever American music they could get their hands on. One of the first manifestations of this was a fascination with trad jazz. This is traditional New Orleans jazz, which became popular throughout the country. Somewhere in the mid-50s, taste changed to skiffle, an English adaptation of traditional American jug band music. And take a second, pause right here, and listen to a little bit of that with Rock Island Line. So once skiffle wore out, British music fans turned to other American music styles, most notably the blues and R&B. By the late 1950s, there was an entire generation of young people who were turning on to Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Bill Haley, and Elvis Presley. Liverpool, England was an interesting seaport town in the 1950s. It was, as it acted as a sponge for American pop culture, especially rock and roll, that was brought over by sailors. So take a second and look at the map of the United Kingdom. Can you find Liverpool? So that was basically a seaport where they were shipping out goods and bringing goods in. And so because of that, they were going to America, and while they were there, they would pick up the music and they would bring it back. And so that's why the youth of Liverpool had exposure to music from America. John Lennon was so completely taken with Elvis that he put together his own band, and he called it the Quarrymen. Paul McCartney auditioned for this group and got the job. McCartney brought along a school friend, George Harrison, to play lead guitar, and then Lennon's friend, Pete Best, was the drummer until 1962. By 1960, the group had changed its name to the Beatles. The Beatles then added Stu Sutcliffe on bass, and now Stu Sutcliffe, he left after just a year to pursue a career in art, and now looking back on that, I wonder if he would have made the same decision. In 1961, they first appeared at Liverpool's Cavern Club, which was an underground pub, and by their last show, they were drawing long lines. In late 1961, Brian Epstein became their manager, changing their image to more upscale with matching suits, thin ties, and mop-top haircuts. His contact with George Martin, who was a composer and producer, gave the Beatles an audition. On June 6, 1962, the Beatles went into London office building on Abbey Road and recorded 4 songs. Martin decided to sign them, although not impressed with their music. After they were signed, things started to happen very quickly. Martin told them to replace their drummer, and they did, with Richard Starkey, who also went by Ringo Starr. The band went to work on their first album. The first album was Please Please Me, and the Beatles at this time had a very hectic touring schedule. By November 1963, their second album with the Beatles was released, and this was on the exact same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. It went to number 1 in the UK, mixed with originals and covers. By this time, the group was constantly being mobbed by fans, and after a performance in October, the Daily Mirror coined the term Beatlemania. in a headline, and of course this stuck. On February 7, 1964, the nation had been mourning the murder of President John F. Kennedy for 11 weeks, and America was ready to move forward. The Beatles were smart, they were funny, bold, idealistic, and diverse, and the baby boomer generation just ate them up. The group's first appearance was on The Ed Sullivan Show, where it was viewed by about 73 million people. Pause right here and watch a little bit of the very first performance on The Ed Sullivan Show. In July, the third album, called A Hard Day's Night, was released, spending 21 weeks at number 1. It is the first Beatles album that utilized a 4-track tape machine, allowing the group to overdub parts and use the studio in innovative ways. The fourth album, Beatles for Sale, which actually kicked the third album off of number 1, was released in December, but received lukewarm critical acclaim. There were still some gems like 8 Days a Week. The first album to signal the experimental future of the Beatles recording was Help, released August 1965. Part of the evolution was the result of the famous meeting with Bob Dylan in the summer of '64. Dylan's influence was immense and immediate, revitalizing the group at the very moment that they were ready to evolve both musically and lyrically. From this point on, the lyrics began to take on increased social, political, and cultural significance and expanded into more musically diverse styles. And they started using outside musicians. So please take a second to listen to the song Yesterday, and I want you to notice the use of strings within the song. Of course, it's pretty common to hear that today, but at the time that was quite unique. Rubber Soul is often considered the Beatles' coming-of-age album, released in December of 1965. It covered social issues with more lyrical depth, and it also introduced a variety of instruments. So we're going to take a second and we're going to listen to a couple of these songs, Norwegian Wood and In My Life, and if you have a chance, look up Think for Yourself and listen for that fuzzy bass. Okay, so what I want you to do here is hit pause on our video, and I want you to click the link for Norwegian Wood. Now, Beatles albums and songs tend to go down very quickly on YouTube, so if the link is broken, just search it on your own. Pause here for a second. All right, did you recognize that unique instrument? Well, hopefully you did, and you figured out that it was the sitar, which is a plucked string instrument that's used mainly in Indian classical music. And so there's a picture of George Harrison with the sitar player. Next, I'd love for you to pause here and click the link for In My Life. And again, if the link is broken, just go ahead and search it on YouTube. Now, there's a couple different spots you need to go to. You might want to go skip ahead to 1 minute and 35 seconds, or roughly around there, depending on your recording. And you're going to hear that particular instrument. All right, hopefully you listened to it. What instrument was it? Well, if you said the harpsichord, you would be correct. So the harpsichord is a musical instrument that played just like the piano. It's a keyboard instrument, but it produces the sound by actually plucking the strings instead of the hammer inside a piano that strikes the strings. And so it has a unique timbre to it, and that's what you're hearing there is that harpsichord. In August of 1956, the Beatles released the album Revolver, which is considered their finest work and the first album of the psychedelic era because of the exotic instruments, studio effects, and several drug allusions. And also, we will be talking about the psychedelic era and getting more into that type of music in Module 8. After the release of Revolver, the Beatles discontinued touring due to poor sound reinforcement and screaming mobs, and their music was getting way too dependent on studio technology. However, in June of 1967, restless fans and critics were overjoyed with the release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Sgt. Pepper is called rock's first concept album, although some will argue with you and give that distinction to the Beach Boys album, The Pet Sounds, that we talked about in Module 4. It contains one of the most famous album covers and is the first to include the lyrics on the inside cover. This album manipulated the sound by speeding it up. They would slow it down, they would go backwards, they would layer over each other. They used marching bands, symphony orchestras, and voices talking. And I have a couple of examples that I'd like you to listen to. So pause right here and listen to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and then also listen to A Day in the Life. Specifically towards the end, about a minute and 50 seconds in, you're going to hear, and that's roughly depending on which recording you're listening to, you're going to hear something unique. Take a second, pause, and I'll be right back with you. All right, so let's talk about Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. What did you notice about it? Well, if you didn't notice anything, I want you to listen to it again. And on the verses, you're going to hear it sounds a lot darker, and it is so that means it's in a minor key, and then it's also in 3. So there's 3 beats per measure. But when you get to the choruses, it changes over to a more upbeat, happy sound, which means it's in major, and it also goes into 4. So there's 4 beats per measure. See if you can listen to that again and pick that out. Next, A Day in the Life, if you listen to that, when you got to roughly about a minute and 50 seconds in, you should have heard the symphony orchestra being played there. So hopefully you recognize that. So in August, the band suffered a major setback when manager Brian Epstein died from an accidental drug overdose. From this point on, the Beatles would try to manage themselves, one of the first of many bad business decisions that they made, which contributed to the group's downfall. In December of 1967, Magical Mystery Tour was released. By the release of The Beatles, which is also known as the White Album, the inner tensions were surfacing. Lennon and McCartney were losing control of publishing rights with their new music company, Apple, and was losing money due to mismanagement. And then John had a new girlfriend, Yoko Ono, who was a constant unwelcomed presence. Nonetheless, the White Album is a remarkable double album. Many of the songs were recorded without the full group in attendance. And some examples here are Blackbird, which we should have a link down below, and Obla Di, Obla Da. In 1969, the release of Yellow Submarine, which is actually called the worst Beatles album, was basically just a manifestation of the ever-worsening band morale. The next album was not immediately released, but Let It Be's concept was to go back to live performing by staging a surprise noontime concert on the rooftop of Apple offices on January 30th, 1969. However, with tempers flaring, the task of finishing the project was just too much. George Martin quit, George Harrison walked out for a few days, and by the time it was to be produced, no one wanted to stick around to mix it. So they actually brought in Phil Spector to reproduce the entire album. The band had broke up before its release in 1970. The last album recorded by the Beatles was Abbey Road, and considered some of their finest work. George Martin was persuaded to return as producer, and the studios had installed a new 8-track recorder. Synthesizers were also used for the very first time. And so we have an example here of Come Together. So take a second, pause, click the link, and listen to it and see if you can hear those synthesizers being used in the music. The Beatles' breakup was messy. Business entanglements, lawsuits, and Lennon's anger would continue on for years, but one thing was clear: the Beatles would never record or perform together ever again. In the 1960s, the Rolling Stones began calling themselves the world's greatest rock and roll band, but because their rise to fame closely followed the Beatles, many felt that they were actually just the second greatest band. The Stones were forced to portray themselves as dangerous, and they created this anti-Beatles image, and the ploy actually worked. Their on-stage image in the persona of Mick Jagger was the most boldly sexual and threatening of their time. Off-stage, the scandals and bad behavior of their personal lives only served to intensify their images. The Rolling Stones created some of rock's most memorable anthems, and they produced 5 albums. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards grew up together, going to school together briefly, but it was a chance reunion on a commuter train that brought the two together and discovering their love for American R&B. Brian Jones, who was a blues guitarist, became acquainted with the pair through London's blues bar scene. They played their first gig as the Rolling Stones, which that name actually came from a Muddy Waters tune. In 1963, Bill Wyman on bass and Charlie Watts on drums joined them. Decca Records signed them in May of '63 with their first single to cover one of Chuck Berry's songs, Come On. So take a second, pause here, and I want you to listen to both versions. I want you to listen to the Rolling Stones version of Come On as well as the original version by Chuck Berry and see if you can compare it a little bit. In late '63, the Stones embarked on a 3-year tour. By the end of '64, the Stones were finally beginning to break through in the U.S. In '65, the Stones finally hit #1 in the U.S. with I Can't Get No Satisfaction. Take a second, pause here, and listen to a little bit of that song. Mid-1966, the Stones released Aftermath, where they mixed the blues, country, psychedelic, and boogie-woogie influences, and they introduced unique instruments. Now, take a second, click on Paint It Black. This is actually one of my favorite songs from the 60s. So take a second and listen to it. What unique instrument are you hearing? All right. Could you figure it out? Well, we actually heard this instrument earlier on. We heard the sitar when we were looking at some of the Beatles music, and so it is the sitar that you are hearing in Paint It Black. Now, let's look at another song. Let's look at Under My Thumb. So pause here, click the link, listen to Under My Thumb, and figure out what instrument you're hearing that is unique. All right, did you figure it out? Well, if you said the marimba, which I'm sure many of you did, you would be correct. That was a little sarcasm there. So the percussion instrument that uses wooden bars and those resonators. The resonators are the silver pipes you see there. That is called the marimba, and that is the instrument that you are hearing in Under My Thumb. All right, one more we're going to look at. So pause right here, listen to a little bit of Lady Jane, and you're going to hear a very unique instrument. All right, what instrument did you hear? Did you hear the dulcimer? Well, I hope you did hear the dulcimer, but this is a fretted instrument that's plucked. It's also referred to as the mountain dulcimer there, but it is, hopefully being from Kentucky, you're familiar with the dulcimer. In fact, some of you may have even got to play a dulcimer in your music classes when you went to school. From the beginning, Brian Jones had been the de facto leader of the group, but Jagger's onstage antics and Richard's guitar playing had shifted the public's focus. As Jones sensed that he was being reduced to second-class citizen, as well as his girlfriend actually left him for Richards, his drug use started to increase. On July 3, 1969, he was found dead in his swimming pool. He was then replaced by Mick Taylor. In 1968, the psychedelic, their Satanic Majesty's Request, was released with the help of a new producer named Jimmy Miller. Now notice the cover. This was actually patterned after the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper cover. In May of '69, Honky Tonk Woman was released, and in November, Let It Bleed. As the Stones wound up their first American tour in 5 years, there was plans made to thank America in a free stage performance or concert in San Francisco. After several locations were turned down, the last-minute location was the Ultimate Raceway location. And because it was last minute, it was very hastily prepared and it was very much mismanaged. They hired Hell's Angels to provide security, and they actually paid them in beer. And they applied brute force to keep order among the overflow crowd. And by the time the Stones took the stage, chaos and violence were erupting, and the cameras were rolling. The Hell's Angels violently stabbed to death an audience member in front of the stage. The Stones fled for their lives on a helicopter. Since the early 70s, the Stones have continued to tour and record, staying naughty but no longer dangerous. Although never as commercially successful as the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, the Who were unquestionably one of rock's most innovative and influential bands. Not only were they the prototype of the power trio format, they were the first rock band to incorporate synthesizers into their compositional process, rather than just use it as an added-on effect. They brought stage violence and drama to rock like no other band before them. In 1969, they produced the first rock opera, Tommy, which was universally hailed as a masterpiece and was later made into not only a feature film, but also a Broadway musical. The Who did all this despite the friction caused by constantly clashing personalities within the band. All right, take a second, pause here, and listen to My Generation by The Who. The mid-60s produced British groups with a rougher, blues-oriented sound that tended to be sinister-looking with rude and defiant attitudes. The most prominent, influential of these were the Kinks, the Yardbirds, and the Animals. The Kinks' sound was heavily based on distorted power chords or fuzz tone effects, making them an important predecessor to hard rock and heavy metal. Pause right here and listen to You Really Got Me. The Yardbirds have achieved immortal status by virtue of the 3 legendary lead guitarists that passed through the band. 18-year-old Eric Clapton joined in 1963 and in '65 quit when they became more pop-oriented. A virtuoso guitarist, Jeff Beck, replaced Clapton, and eventually the addition of Jimmy Page on bass completed the band. So, this band eventually is going to turn into a group you've probably heard of, if not listened to on a regular basis. But the Yardbirds changed their name later on in the '70s to Led Zeppelin. So you're probably more familiar with Led Zeppelin. Take a second, pause right here, and listen to For Your Love. The Animals were formed in Newcastle in 1962. Traditional folk songs greatly influenced this group, as seen in The House of the Rising Sun, and this is also found on Bob Dylan's first album. So take a second, pause here, and listen to House of the Rising Sun. I actually think this example or this song is more well-known than the original by Bob Dylan, but if you get a chance, also search on YouTube Bob Dylan's version of it so you can compare the two. Eric Clapton established himself as Britain's premier blues guitarist and developed a cult following as he formed the hard rock power trio Cream. Cream became immensely popular in both the UK and the US with their high-volume, extended blues jam sessions. And so an example we have for you is Sunshine of Your Love. Take a second and listen to this song here. The British blues revival spurred a blues revival in America, as seen with the next two artists, Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. So even though we're talking about the British invasion's direct effect on American music gave us artists like these two. So don't forget that these are Americans. So American Jimi Hendrix expanded the sonic possibilities of the electric guitar and redefined the relationship between music and noise with his startling use of feedback and other guitar effects in 4 short years. He not only established himself as an innovative guitarist, but as a premier showman and studio technician of his generation. Hendrix was deeply rooted in the blues while playing electric, psychedelic, jazz, hard rock, R&B, and folk. He died in 1970 at the young age of just 27 from drugs, but left a profound legacy that still influences musicians today. Take a second, pause, and listen to some Purple Haze. Another American artist, Janis Joplin, was a nonconformist who loved the music of black blues singers. Her singing style was inspired by blues singers Bessie Smith and Big Mama Thornton, who had a rough edge and was gritty and raw. With her dynamic ability to move from barely an audible whisper to a full tilt screaming, she transfixed audiences. Joplin, who also died of a drug overdose at the young age of 27 years old. She embodied the spirit of the 1960s. She was a liberated woman with an extroverted stage image and a very soulful voice. So take a second and end the lecture here by listening to A Piece of My Heart by Janis Joplin.